Yeah, China has sort of been my first love when I first started looking at the IMF crisis in the late 90s. So I've really been focused on Chinese economics and national security since about 98. And then my experience within the federal government really allowed me to identify how China actually achieves their state priorities abroad. So specifically with influence, so how do countries achieve their state priorities through influence? I've really been focused on that since 2015, working for the federal government out here for Indo-PACOM Command. So just to caveat this, China being my first love, this is not about countering China. So I don't want this to be specifically about the PRC, but I do want it to be more about the peace and prosperity, and then promoting that free and open Indo-Pacific. And it's really how we protect and promote the good governance within the region, which is what we're ultimately trying to get at here. So with my experience talking with people about influence and competition being the operative word, within governments talking about China, I really have to start with a historical approach, because competition and influence may be a new term. It may be an experience that that you've actually experienced yourself, or within your country, or within your government, or a business. So I just really want to start with the history. So where did this all start? So I like to always start this with China's perspective. So in order to look at what China is doing, we really have to put on that Chinese lens. So historically speaking, I would like to take this back to Admiral Liu Huaqing. So he was the founder of the modern PLA Navy for China. And he said that he wanted to have effective control of up until the first island chain by 2010, effective control up to the second island chain by 2020, and then be the hegemonic power within the Pacific by 2040. So the magical part about that is that he said that back in 1985. So that shows how persistent China is with their strategy, and how they continue to achieve that strategy year after year through persistence. So they've been so persistent and so successful with this plan and that they've actually moved that date up from 2040 to 2027. So by 2027, they expect to have full hegemonic power and to push the US out as the hegemonic power of the Pacific by 2027. So how are they doing this, and what have they been focused on? So a lot of the big talks, especially within the US, has been primarily about diplomatic and defense. So they've been looking at defense primarily because what is China doing to push the US out? What are they doing to achieve this goal? And that's with China's military modernization. So a lot of the military modernization that China has supports, directly counters US comparative advantage within the region. So, the classic example is China's development of the DF-26, otherwise known as the carrier killer. So that is, that is the US's primary tool within, with establishing their Blue Navy, and they're creating weapons to directly counter that. So that is pushing the US out through military modernization and Chinese strike capability. But how do they get beyond that? And this has been the real developing question for this. So beyond that, they're achieving this and going beyond their strike capabilities through influence. So Lowy Institute is a great source for this with their Great Power Index and their Global Power Index. And their latest one just came out this year in 2023, where China is at par and even surpassing in two specific indicators for their Global Power Index. So they're at par, but they are surpassing the US in economic and diplomatic relationships within the Pacific region. So those are the two largest global powers within the region, and that shows how quickly that they're getting on this. So, like I said, we have to view this through China's lens. So what does China see for itself? What are they doing? So first of all, China sees itself as an up-and-coming power. I mean, that is their stance. They see the US as the current global power wanting to push us out. They see themselves as up-and-coming. So they have a different approach. So they especially have the top-down approach. They also work bilaterally. So top-down approach, of course, Xi Jinping runs everything and it trickles down. So this is across society, across directors in order to achieve their state priorities. They also work bilaterally. So they don't like multilateral organizations. They like to work directly one-on-one with a country, which allows them to identify, unique challenges and unique opportunities for them to achieve their state priority within that country. And then they are opportunistic. So it's not, the term debt trap diplomacy as an influence is not all encompassing. That's just a very, very small picture of this. So what we see, sorry. So what we see with this is that China is opportunistic. So they do not just focus on harming or taking advantage of debt trap diplomacy. They'll also focus on incentives. And I think that that's really important, that it is not just one type of activity that they do. So examples of how China prioritizes the top-down approach and how they really blend together that dual use. Dual use, I mean, by achieving both, making money during economic times, but then being able to make war in war times. So the dual use capabilities of business, of their society, different elements of their society is really important. So one good example, I like to stress on this, on how China achieves business and achieves influence, is number one, their national security laws. A lot of new national security laws that actually extend beyond China domestically. Some of their national security laws, they extend their jurisdiction to Chinese companies, Chinese people who are actually overseas. So some of the reach that they have is that if a national security actor from China goes and questions them, they have to work alongside. They have to answer their questions. They have to respond to them. Another one is that in order to register a business in China, they have to submit a business license to the military regional office, which describes how their company will be used as a dual use enterprise. And that goes from military regional office all the way up to the national level. And the people and companies that can check that off to say that, yes, we're here to make money, but then we're also going to achieve your state priorities, get bumped up to the top of the list when it comes to registering their business within China and then operating abroad. So therefore, very opportunistic, very top-down driven. So now I want to talk about what the US is doing. And I think this is probably the topic that pains me the most. So my perspective and why I really wanted to come on this talk is that, through my visits in DC, talking with the headquarters of multiple agencies who have jurisdiction mission to look at China, to look at competition, to look at what the US is doing, I've really heard a lot of silence. I've heard a lot of hyperboles, when it comes to China. But again, this is why I want to stress that this is not about China, not about countering China, but it's looking at the activities, looking at the influence, and looking at the results. What is China doing? Not just countering those types of activities, but then how do we actually fill that void? I really like the analogy of, when you're looking at influence within foreign countries, a lot of these countries just want a martini. They don't care where they get their vermouth or where they get their gin. They just want their martini. So I think that that's an important perspective to have with this when we ask ourselves, what are we doing to counter influence? What are we doing to counter these activities? How are we protecting our countries and being more resilient in the face of influence or competition? So the US does not have a top-down approach. We are very siloed within our specific agencies. Each agency has a specific jurisdiction and mission. So there's no overall champion for this. So this creates a lot of bureaucracies. So with no champion, no one's saying, this is what we need to do. This is what we need to do to counter a whole of society approach for influence. Just getting our own agencies and directorates within those agencies to work together has been a big, big problem. Another point is that we just focus on our own tools. So we don't approach this from a China lens. We don't approach this as, what is our competitor doing? And this is where we really have to start incorporating competitive intelligence. What are they doing? How are they achieving that? And that is how I'm going to structure my resources and my approach to win within that competition, within that influence game. So a lot of the times the US agencies are saying, I have a tool, I'll take FBI for an example, where there has to be a US person nexus for that. That's just an example. So I'm not down talking FBI, but that is just an example of saying that's what it takes for them to get into this game, identify it, monitor, investigate, and then regulate and enforce the laws that would position the US to actually be providing something more to Pacific Islands. So again, without a competition champion, we are really acting within silos across this. So this is where we're really addressing this through diplomatic and defense. But the meaning of competition is really achieving state priorities below that military threshold. So that is the number one problem that we have. So what do we have to do? So again, we have to approach this through China's lens. So we have to understand the problem of influence and competition by what is China doing, who is doing it, how are they doing it, and what are they actually achieving? So one thing that I think that links all of us together who are on this call is that we've seen some form of Chinese influence. We've been witness to it, we've read about it. And one thing that we've been able to accomplish just within this past year is getting the interagencies within Washington, D.C. to actually narrow down to specific topics and specific categories of China's whole of society influence actors. And I think this is really important because I'm sure that we've all experienced a specific influence activity from one of these actors. But I want to get into how comprehensive of a strategy this really is that China is using. So just to start, for the 7 categories that have been blessed off as the 7 categories is business, political, information, transnational criminal organization, academia, cultural and friendship, and security actors. So within these 7 categories, these are the levers that China is using to influence within host countries to achieve their state priorities. So that's the first step, is to identify who is actually doing the influencing. The next step is that viewing this through the China lens is that China operates from a top down. They have a business model. So domestically, inside China, they have their specific controls. They have their tasking. They're able to control what different actors do across these 7 categories within host nations, so Pacific Islands or really globally, and they can control. So a lot of these businesses are still there to make money. Transnational criminal organizations are still committing crimes, but then they are being focused into achieving state priorities, and they have national security laws and full control of these actors to make sure that they are doing what they're doing. So there's runaway, of course, runaway cases, of course, there's, things that, the party doesn't know, but, with their control of information, IT, and access to get to people, we can assume a lot from that. So whole of society, China is using their business model and then understanding what it takes to get from that actual activity of influence within your country, within your government, within whatever activity or function that you're seeing, and then tracing that business model all the way back up to the top. I think this is probably the trickiest thing for anyone to do, and this is why you have to approach this by what is China do. You have to have an expert in China to say, this is how China achieves their priorities. This is how their government functions. This is how their businesses function. Security, across these 7 categories, this is how they function. This is who they take rules from and tasking from. So once you're able to do that, you're able to identify that, let's take, for example, that a Chinese state-owned enterprise is investing in a port in a Pacific island, for example. You have to ask yourself, what is China's intent? Why do they want a port? Does this fit along their Belt and Road Initiative? Does this fit, with what they're trying to do with, establishing a dual use port, which again, these companies are held to by law. if the state, if the PRC does deem that appropriate. So that is your first step, is identification. Understanding how China gets into a country to invest in a port and ultimately create a sovereign Chinese territory within the most strategic asset of a foreign country, the port. You have to do some forensic analysis on that and say, who actually allowed this to happen? Who is in charge of the purchase of it, of the tender? Who, built up the infrastructure? Who did the dredging? Who did the utilities? Who did the actual real estate purchases? Who actually, talked to the regulators within that host country to allow this to happen? So now you're understanding, China's business model. So having that as a frame and understanding that they do work bilaterally, they are opportunistic. That is how you can start to break this apart. And actually, when you do this, you can realize that it's not just a Chinese state-owned enterprise, it's going to reach across the majority of these categories. For example, political, if there's a Chinese embassy, working with, the lawmakers or economic and commercial counselor's office out of the Chinese embassy, they're the ones who are probably, laying the political groundwork. So now you have two links there: business, political. Information. If you start seeing things in your newspapers saying, this is a win-win, this is common language that China uses, across news agencies and newspapers, saying this is a win-win. There's common, terms that are used from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and you can identify that. Sometimes transnational criminal organizations, sometimes these state-owned enterprises use human trafficking, visa fraud, really just operations below international norms and standards. So working like a transnational criminal organization. And then that gets into private security companies. So what I'm saying is that once you identify, one influence actor or activity, you can start to talk to people that know how China works and work your way left or right to identify what is the full influence activity that's happening within, my country or my organization. Only then can you look at who are these people affiliated with, where you can actually get a glimpse of the intent of the state priorities that China is trying to achieve. I think that's probably most critical. And I don't want to get too into, the methodologies here. But what I want to do is talk about, what's needed here. So I think a comprehensive, strategic, and sub-regional approach is really, really necessary here. This is where, the right approach through, a China lens, so someone who knows China, looking at or understanding, Pacific Islands with having that country and project level experience, understanding who are the power brokers, who are the enabling environment, regulatory analysis, how are things actually being done within this host nation, and then looking at CMI as well. So CMI is countering malign influence. So understanding the malign influence actors, the activities, definitely through these 7 categories, and then how they link up together. I think that is the best approach, and I think that with this varied of a group, like I said, we've all had our experiences and questions when it comes to Chinese influence, especially in the Pacific. So I want to take time now to answer any questions that I can, because I know that this can go in many, many ways with the stakeholders on this call. So I'm happy to field any questions on that.
So actually, I'd like to just start up. One of the things that you mentioned, you talked about earlier before the conversation began, that was that the dearth of American and even Western commercial interests as I remember it, there was some $800 million that was going to be devoted to the Pacific Islands, new U.S. embassies, this big call to arms, if you will, or call to trading or call to aid. Anyway, and how can that be done? How if there are no companies ready to participate?
Yeah. So I'll just briefly tell the story that I spoke about before we started recording. And like I said, this is from the past month. So looking, going to DC, talking with the policymakers, and it was great to have them all in the same room, all saying that we are concerned about China. We've heard that China is the number one long-term threat in the national defense strategy and the national security strategy. So we're identifying it, and we have these tools. What do we do with them? So the biggest, question that was most concerning to me was when someone asked, who's the champion of this, and no one had an answer. Was it DoD for the planning? Was it National Security Council? How do they fit that in with all of their meetings that they have? So no real champion for this. And then going to the regional level, going to some of the largest infrastructure conferences within the region. Again, you have State Department for the embassies. You have new USAID headquarters within the Pacific, Development Financial Corporation, who works on public-private partnerships, commerce. They're present, and again, they're stating the same policy words, but then there's no public and private partnership. There's a lack of private investment within the region. And one of the scariest parts about this is that for multilateral organizations such as Asia Development Bank. Again, I have lots of good friends at Asia Development Bank, but U.S. is one of the biggest contributors to Asia Development Bank. One of the biggest recipients of Asian development projects are actually Chinese state-owned enterprises. And the problem that they said that they have is that no one else is bidding on these projects. It is purely China, and they're willing to put in the work and willing to align it to achieve their state initiative and state priorities. So it is just missing. So where the U.S. is coming in is that the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, I think that might be what you were referring to, has been promised since 2017. So PDI funds coming to the region. We're finally seeing some of the first drops in the bucket out here for that. But again, that is primarily for military development for the U.S. How do we get more boats and airplanes, within this region, because again, China has been focusing on their military modernization and surpassing us both qualitatively and quantitatively. State Department, USAID, this is where defense and development really come into play. Defense money is promised to come here, but again, it's going to achieve DoD priorities. It's not going to achieve advancements in competition. And then development dollars are just starting to drop here. So the Counter PRC Influence Fund by State Department and USAID is a great example. It pales in comparison to the amount, but it's showing that they're starting to align efforts. They're starting to align funding. But the biggest thing is understanding competition and how do they align these new funds with their existing jurisdiction and missions. So what you'll find is that a lot of people are rooted in the jobs that they've had. A lot of the decision makers, have been in their positions for 20, 25 years. And this is new. I mean, competition is new. So especially getting a development organization, in line with this, it's tough because they've never had to work this before. A lot of these people don't have the right China experience to align the funding with the actual projects. Mm-hmm. So linking that international policy and funding with actual country and project level with the necessary expertise in between is really, really absent from the region.
So as a related question from Robert Riley, who was a U.S. ambassador between 2016 and 2020, I'm sure you know. He said, I certainly saw the whole of society influence peddling China has adopted. It was a major priority while I was in the FSM. Two questions. Did COVID hamper their efforts? And is China's current economic difficulties beginning to hamper their efforts now?
Yeah, those are great questions. It's probably the number one asked question right now is China's current economic condition. But COVID absolutely did. However, you did see certain categories increasing their influence levels. So COVID, so across the 7 categories during COVID, the cultural and friendship organizations really, really excel. So China, with their influence operations, with providing testing or shots or anything with COVID relief,
Hmm.
it greatly increased. Transnational criminal organizations also did, because they don't really abide by international norms and standards. So really we saw an increase in, let's say, online casinos or anything that happens. There's a common term actually called pig butchering, which I encourage everyone to look up because it is probably one of the rising crimes that we see happening that's affecting people. It's done through social engineering, and it's defrauding people out of millions and millions of dollars. FBI just made it one of their top investigations in the region. So we saw that type of activity increase really across the Pacific during COVID. Now, for the de-risking, sorry, just really quick, with the de-risking of China, we absolutely do see the decrease within the state-owned enterprises with investments. But in the places where they already are investing, we see that money go straight back to China to really pump up their coffers in that respect. If they're already in there and already have a mechanism to profit from a port and take it back, just as an example.
Yeah, again, a semi-related. Jim Moriarty asked, is Xi Jinping losing his confidence in the assertion that the PRC's economy is inevitably rising while that of the U.S. is inevitably declining? And if so, what does that mean for competition in the Pacific? He certainly has shifted sharply towards wanting economic dialogue with the U.S., while equally clearly wanting to get BRI spending under control, including in the Pacific.
That's a great question. I mean, if I could understand what Xi Jinping thought, I'd be a very, very wealthy man. But
or not.
I think that what we're seeing here, I mean, it's all about regime survival and regime legitimacy. So I think that what we're seeing, especially with the downturn in China's economics, is for example, the top-down approach, especially with the Central Financial Commission. So I think this is a perfect example to show how Xi is trying to move away from market socialism more towards where he has control. So it used to be the National Financial Commission. Now it's the Central Financial Commission. And he just promoted, I think, the Vice Premier Ho Lifeng is now in charge of this. So it's a new regulatory measure, making sure that finance is under CBC's control, and Xi Jinping ultimately has control over all things, especially with finance. So I think that that's really telling where Xi Jinping's head is at. More control, more authoritarian, more really under his thumb.
Yeah.
I think following those actions, I think, is very, very telling for what Xi Jinping is thinking.
Yeah, actually, I'd like to put in a plug for a new study that just came out. It was written by a British diplomat, analyst, and friend of mine, Charles Parton. And it's called Plateau China, Reform in the 10 Years After the Third Plenum of 2013. Because he argues, as I think, that China, it's not going to fall off a cliff, but it's going to be, the economic growth is going to go on for a long time. But yes. I think the bigger issue, and I agree, Xi Jinping is exerting more and more control, but that hasn't really worked out very well for the Chinese economy over the last 10 years. So anyway.
And with that, with all this talk, I don't enjoy reading about de-risking or decoupling, because the economy is bigger than that. The global economy is bigger than us deciding to do that. So, and it will take years and years and years to see any other effects, but I don't see any sort of break or clean break with that. So, no, I'll be really interested to read that as well.
Just to go back a little bit earlier, you referenced that China doesn't work or like to work multilaterally, but Denny Roy points out that they have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. They want to join CPTPP. They do work through ASEAN to try to sabotage the South China Sea Code of Conduct. And as you were pointing out, they use ADB and World Bank ways of getting into these countries. So do you want to clarify that?
Yes. Yeah. So the two strategic levels I'm looking at, yes. So they are trying to get more into multilateral organizations. Probably the United Nations is probably one of the biggest ones where they're trying to exert their influence. Again, I would categorize this under the cultural and friendship category of what they're doing to influence. Sabotage was a great word they used within ASEAN. So yes, I completely agree with that for influence. But on the more tactical level, on when they actually go into a specific country to actually lay down a specific project, infrastructure project, that is where the bilateral comes into play. So yes, multilateral for very strategic influence, sabotage, changing it more to Chinese characteristics. But when it comes to actual people on the ground doing these projects, that's where it's bilateral. This is where they actually provide security lessons for construction workers. They say, here are the culture and norms, even for construction workers. We'll have them go to a school and say, here's how you can actually have the upper hand when it comes to operating within this country. Here are the specific power brokers that you need to talk to in order to win this bid for this infrastructure company. So it's very bilateral, very, very opportunistic. But yes, I will clarify on for those two different intents, two different purposes for their, again, understanding their business model and what they're doing and what they're trying to achieve. I would just put that under two different business models within influence.
Let's go out to 30, even higher than 30,000 feet. But a very timely question, given what may happen in San Francisco later this month if she does attend APEC. Richard Palish asks, what would be your 5 top recommendations to correct present Chinese-U.S. relations, or if not correct, at least stabilize?
Yeah, no, these these are great questions. Well, first of all, I wouldn't have Nancy Pelosi go to Taiwan. That was everyone saw the spike down in that for relationships between the U.S. and China. But I mean, it's going to have to be open dialogue. It's 5 that's a lot to think about for the 5. But I think that the U.S. has to understand this issue more thoroughly. I think that after being in DC talking with the policymakers, they are very hyperbolic against China. Everyone just saying China bad without fully understanding what the issues are. I think it starts with that. That's why I wanted to have a 101 on Chinese influence, starting here. And then really, this is where I have to start whenever I speak about this. So understanding that, stop the hyperbolic speeches and policy speeches that all of China is bad. On every different level, on enforcement and regulatory levels, stop including all of China being bad. There's certain, types of enforcement measures, where they want to, for example, kick out all students who are doing a specific, who are grouped within China because there's, a couple, examples of people, stealing IP or something similar to that. So that shows a really, poor understanding of China, not looking at this through their lens, what they're trying to achieve and how they're actually achieving it. So breaking it down to, this is the big activity, malign influence, breaking it down to the actual components and subcomponents to really understand what is happening. I think it all starts with that, and then we can get into specific, recommendations for different agencies or stakeholders within this space.
Yeah. There's also an issue here in my mind, and we have a question that sort of reflects this. China scores a lot of own goals. They go into these places and they overplay their hand. So this is from Ashley Meredith, who is the FSM anthropologist since 2016. And she says, our team surveyed both land and conduct ethnography for development projects, input from communities. And the common factor was that the local culture and Chinese culture resonated with each other. However, it's well known that Chinese built structures haven't lasted or look nice even after 5 years. So what could be done to foster sort of cross-cultural understandings and strengthen relationships overall?
Yeah, so I mean, the poor quality of a lot of Chinese development projects is very apparent. And all of the infrastructure conferences I go to within the region, that is very apparent. But like I said before, China is still winning these bids. So their achievement within the space influence, through infrastructure and through business actors, it's still winning at first, but we are seeing the degradation of that with relationships. I think the Fijian Highways Authority is a great example of the Chinese state-owned enterprise went into Fiji to build the highways, and this is the first example of a country level actually canceling the Chinese state-owned enterprise and essentially kicking that company out because they didn't have proper sanitation. They didn't include safety into any of their projects, Chinese craftsmanship. So I think it's first identifying and then having the really understanding the process of what would be needed to get them to get up to grade or to stop the project. There's another project that happened in, I believe, Tuvalu, where a Chinese, I believe the Chinese state-owned enterprise went in. They only accomplished 60% of the work. It was supposed to be a 2-year project. It was after 5 years, and 60% of the work was done. They said they needed $20 million more, but then they also said, but you can just give us 10 million, and we'll leave, and you can have someone else come in there. So the follow through with a lot of these projects is falling short, and I think that is catching up with a lot of these projects. But who is there to fill in the void? I mean, that's the biggest question. Mm-hmm. It's going to be another Chinese state-owned enterprise, especially if they were the only ones to bid on it. It's just going to be another one. And if the U.S. continues to be absent within the space and not providing that, then we're at a real standstill. And a lot of that is because a lot of the Pacific, a lot of their code, and standards that U.S. private companies, have to stand by. Architecture firms, construction companies, a lot of these countries can't support that, like electrification or standards of concrete or procurement issues. So the U.S. private companies just don't see the profit in going out there. So this is why New Zealand and Australia infrastructure firms have really been winning in this realm. I think they take on we have, let's say New Zealand construction standards at 100%, but 80% is okay. Let's say in Marshall Islands, that's okay. And understanding procurement routes and where to get your supply. So I think that's really important. I think that this is where we really need to push. Mm-hmm. I think the shoddiness of a lot of these construction projects is creating a real stir in this. But again, this is where we have to work with development. This is where defense and development, this is where economic security, employment security is national security. Mm-hmm. So this is where we really have to work more with the development dollars and make these public-private partnerships work.
Well, to that point, Frank Stanley, who's a retired state foreign service officer, economic officer, says, I agree with you that stovepiping has traditionally been a problem in the U.S. government, but I have also found that under certain administrations, the coordinating role of the NSC has been more focused, intense, and that has had a positive impact on addressing major policy issues. The administration that comes to mind is the Obama administration. Is the Biden administration NSC not leading the charge in the current White House on China?
So I agree. So that was my opinion when talking with Congress, is that NSC should be the champions for this. They should be the belly button of all things within this realm. However, the understanding, even just the definition of competition is still not agreed upon by all the different agencies. So yes, I would. So NSC is there. So, I'm working with specific NSC members. But again, the same problem remains, is that the understanding of competition and what China is doing is still falls short, from getting, so we're getting the right people in the room, but it's a steep learning curve. And it's going to take behavioral change and knowledge. So it's I don't want to say how long it would take, but to have any sort of behavioral change, it's going to take some years to do. But yes, I do believe that it should rest with National Security Council and they do have the right people in there. So I do see that, but getting them the right knowledge, especially within the right topics, and letting the right agencies to actually create the effects, to stop those types of activities, but also fill in the void to where we, the U.S. and our partners and allies are the preferred partners in the region. That's where we ultimately have to get to.
Just going back to the public-private partnerships and the lack of or dearth of American corporations out there. I mean, the Japanese have have a terrific track record of building infrastructure all over East Asia. I mean, they're building the Saigon subway system. The Koreans certainly are no slouches when it comes to high-speed trains and highways and the like. I assume even like probably the Vietnamese at some point will be able to do. Is there something that are they just not bidding on these things? Are they not interested?
No. I'm going to say that this is one of the biggest potential winners in this region. I'm going to say is Japan. I mean, they just had their first Indo-Pacific strategy come out last October, and we're seeing the increase in funding. And I'm actually working through some conduits, directly with Prime Minister Kishida's office and the Minister of Defense, and getting this to the 400 military industrial companies. As much as you want to say that, for example, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries build missiles next to refrigerators. So we're getting the right message to them. So I've actually been engaged in giving them sort of that, what is China doing? How are they doing influence? What are some of the actual activities that Japan cares about within their Indo-Pacific strategy? And what are some recommendations, for the public-private partnerships within Japan to start, using JICA more and aligning, JICA's development efforts, because they are great partners in this region. But again, they lack the partnerships and opportunities, and to get public-private partnerships to work, there has to be some incentive in there. So when you have the public and private partnerships working together, you have sort of a government-backed guarantee that really creates an incentive for private investment to join in on a project. So that public-private partnership cannot be understated. Japan is still learning. So I'm working directly with Japanese companies, and they're asking, what's the appetite? Where are the opportunities? Where are the dollars? Who are the partners that we can partner with, to create more, infrastructure or more projects? Solar projects are great. Another great, electrification. Climate change, greening of technology, where can we insert ourselves? So that's what we're working on right now. So they've been here, but it's been, very, fit for purpose for them, but they're expanding that view to what others are doing in this region. So I think that's phenomenal. I think that's going to be a big, big winner moving forward.
Dan Saltman asks, are there greater opportunities for U.S. influence and engagement through grassroots organizations rather than through government organizations?
Absolutely. And this is where the two are not really talking to each other. So when I say the international policy and funding, that's where the big government initiatives are. But then really that country and project level, that's really the grassroots. That's where you actually have to join the two together. You have to be able to translate the two. But grassroots and creating coalitions, across these countries, just to, get the right people in the room, that's going to create what I think is the biggest change. So I think that, Australia had a great approach with making these, countries within their sphere more resilient. Not just building up big walls around their whole country, but being able to have the right tools and resources to identify where they should build walls higher. How do they get the enabling environment within a specific country to work together, and to identify the regulatory environment to say, if we want to use this international policy and funding, or if we want to work with another private company, how do we make this project actually bankable? I think that is probably the most realistic first step with this. Aligning the big international policy and funding is it's a heavy lift. But I think that with the grassroots and just understanding what it takes to get this international policy and funding down to your country to a bankable project, I think that's probably the simplest thing to do. So fully support that. So that's sort of where we come with our approach and our analyses and methodologies to ensure that that happens.
Ashley Meredith again wonders if says the problems facing the Pacific Island states are so imminent, and the funding sources that might be able to help. The paperwork takes so long. Is this also another advantage China has? That they ironically have no red tape.
Yes, and China has just been there. They've created those relationships and those avenues, through these 7 categories. So so they can respond much more effectively. One great thing that the U.S. has is that we don't have top down, but we do have flexibility. So we can absolutely surge in these areas. But you're right. I mean, Marshall Islands is one area that concerns me, the most, especially when it comes to, let's say, digitalization. That's one of China's top, innovations and top areas that they're trying to press. And I see a lot of these Chinese investors coming into, let's say, Marshall Islands, Palau with their high-speed internet, creating these, huge investments. But the real, urgent matter here is that they don't have anything on the books. So, for example, RMI and Palau, the only thing they have in their ledge is, for anything cyber or digital is against cyberbullying. But here are, Chinese companies coming from Hong Kong, Macau, Singapore, who have absolute connections, across these 7 categories. We're pitching them things that, are really, really beyond what their governments can handle. So this is where, again, it goes back to working at the grassroots level, identifying, the risks, the vulnerabilities, and how can we strengthen their organizations and institutions, really comes into play here. So yeah, very, very critical matters. What are we doing about it? We are working on that fervently, actually, in these different areas. So trying to align specific ADB, USAID, State Department dollars to address these issues right away.
All right, we really should close at this point, but I want to. There's one last 30,000-foot question, which I think you'll enjoy. It's from Kathleen Walsh. Do you think dealing with a country as large and globally ambitious as China requires a diplomatic transformation? And do you think State's China House is a step in the right direction? Or is some other approach better to deal with the wide-ranging competition with the PRC? And it really is totally different than anything we've ever seen.
Yeah. Well, getting any sort of diplomatic change from China is, we have not seen them go in the direction that we wanted them to go. I mean, working in this this field for the past couple of decades, between Hawaii and Washington D.C. is that 10 years ago, we hoped that China would come around and be an international stakeholder, but more and more they have not. So getting them to change that way, diplomatically, is just one of the categories that we're working. So diplomatic and defense, the U.S. is not really coordinated or working, across the other categories of influence to counter that influence. So just working diplomatically without addressing the different influence networks that we have an opportunity for, minus transnational criminal organizations, but really across their countering and then inserting ourselves as that preferred partner within that influence category, having them work together. I think that is the key. We can't just do defense alone, can't just do diplomacy alone. It has to be that coordinated effort. And for that, we do need that champion. Yes, if anyone is here on NSC, I would like to ping you on that. But it has to be that comprehensive strategy for us to make any mark. Because like I said, during COVID, COVID hit, so it went up in other areas. Cultural friendship, transnational criminal organizations, and then down in diplomacy because they just weren't letting people in.
Yeah.
So they are able to shift and move like that.
Well, this has been terrific. Thank you so much for taking the time, and good luck getting all of these, herding all of these cats in the region to work together. It's again, thanks very much for doing this for us.